Greetings, people of YouTube. I am Banjo. Welcome back to another video. As you can tell, we are talking about another Cormac McCarthy book today. Actually, I don't think I've done a full-length video on a McCarthy book yet, so this is technically my first Cormac McCarthy book video. Really quick before I start, I just want to give you a quick viewer discretion warning. The topics that we're talking about in today's video are incredibly dark, so if you don't like to hear about dark stories, please don't watch this video. Cormac McCarthy's world is a place of brutal, unrelenting darkness, a landscape where fate is indifferent, justice is an illusion, and suffering is simply a part of existence. And no book exemplifies this more than Outer Dark, his haunting second novel that was released in 1968. A novel steeped in biblical overtones, horror, and Gothic Americana, Outer Dark tells the story of two lost souls wandering a cruel and unfeeling world. But beyond its disturbing plot, it also has a meditation on guilt and the inescapable forces that govern human fate. Today we'll break down this grim masterpiece, unravel its cryptic messages, and explore its place in McCarthy's legacy. Now, this book has become very, I feel like with every Cormac McCarthy book I read, it's just everything gets better and better. And I learned so much more from each book that he's written. And there's always some poetic undertones beneath all of the darkness and all of the horror. There is something actually worth it. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. So, let's begin with the story. Our story begins in isolation, in a nameless backwoods cabin far from the eyes of the world. A woman gives birth. Her name is Renthi Holm. The father of her child, her own brother. Now I know this, I warned you we were going to be talking about dark stuff, but instantly the book opens with mentions of incest. And rather than accept the responsibility for his actions, Kulla does something unthinkable. He tells Renthi that the baby died, but in reality, he carries the newborn into the woods and abandons it, leaving it to fate. In this one act, he sets in motion a journey of endless suffering and pursuit for both himself and his sister. When Renthi discovers the truth, she refuses to accept her child's fate. Driven by an almost supernatural determination, she sets off on foot, searching for the child. She knows it's still alive. Somewhere in her heart, she knows that the child is still there. But Kulla, he leaves their home, and not in pursuit of redemption. He leaves to kind of seek solitude. He does not want to be around people because he is ashamed of himself. And he's trying to outrun something that he doesn't entirely understand. Renthi's journey is one of desperate hope in a world without mercy. She begins asking about a traveling tinker. Now, the tinker is a peddler, a traveling merchant of sorts, you may say. And his whole character is that when nobody wanted this child, when Kulla left it in the woods, he went without intention of saving the child. He found it in the woods, and so he took it and decided to take care of it by giving it to an old woman in a cabin somewhere in the woods. And by the way, this story takes place somewhere in the South, in the backwoods of the American country. And I'm assuming it takes place in the early 1900s. I forgot to mention that. She begins asking about the traveling tinker, as I said. A peddler who she believes has taken the child, which he has, and she doesn't know what purpose, what his intention is for the child. But she knows that he has the kid. Now, as she moves from town to town, begging for food and following the tinker's trail, people react to her with a mix of sympathy and suspicion. Renthi is different from her brother. While naive, she is fundamentally innocent. In McCarthy's world, innocence is often met with cruelty, which is sad to say, but it's true. She meets men who leer at her, women who pity her, and strangers who dismiss her as a foolish girl chasing a ghost. Yet, she persists. Eventually, she finds the Tinker, her eyes pleading and her body weakened from the journey. The Tinker denies having the child. He refuses to return what was never his, and so Rinthi, despite all she has endured, is left empty-handed. Her search ending not in reunion, but in silence and rejection. She does not get the child back. Now, if Rinthi's journey is one, a pursuit of love, Kulla's is one of curse and exile. Kind of, think of Cain from the Bible. Cain in Genesis, he murders his own brother, and because of that, he is cursed, and he wanders the earth. And that's kind of how I see Kulla. He is the Cain of this story. Now, everywhere he goes, misfortune follows him. He stumbles into a swamp and nearly drowns. He takes shelter in a town only to be accused of stealing a pig, which he didn't. He finds work at a sawmill, only for the mill to collapse, killing another man. When he seeks help, he is accused of murder and driven away. Everywhere he goes, people refuse to believe his stories of innocence. It is as though the universe has marked him for suffering, and perhaps it has, in the form of 3 nameless figures. I mentioned these men earlier, and they begin appearing everywhere throughout his journey. They're following him relentlessly, and he does not know why. 3 strangers are undeniably my favorite part of this whole story. As their name suggests, they are strange, they are weird, and there are specific things about each of them that are fun to learn about and dig into. As I said, McCarthy is poetic in all of his language, and he does not hold back with the 3 strangers. As most other Cormac McCarthy antagonists, like Judge Holden, or, we'll just keep it at Judge Holden. Judge Holden's the most common one. I feel like all of his other characters get overlooked, or at least his villains. Kulla's story ends in tragedy and horror. At last, he stumbles upon a massacre. The 3 men are there. They're standing over a pit, and inside something moves. Something cries out. Is it the abandoned child, or is it something else? Did they happen to get their hands on his son? They acknowledge Kulla, and then they do the worst thing possible. They let him live. Now, when Kulla comes across the climax of the story, he has been drifting through this horrifying landscape. He has been relentlessly pursued by bad luck and violence, often narrowly escaping death only to be thrust into new territory. While wandering, Kulla stumbles upon the remnants of a group of travelers, or settlers, and they have been massacred. There is almost nothing left of these people. There is blood everywhere, and, the disemboweled bodies and limbs of these people. And the 3 strangers that have been following him the whole time are here. And they most definitely have committed these killings. Now, for a moment, let's talk about the mysterious strangers, because to me, they are the best part of the book for me. I have dug into the characters a lot, and that's really what shines most in McCarthy's books, is the characters. And the 3 strangers are the greatest characters in this story, so let's break them down real quick. Now, first of all is the leader, or the spokesman. I don't know what other people call him, but that's what I'm going to call him. And his main thing, as his name suggests, is he is the leader. He is the most articulate of the group, and you would expect these 3 homeless wanderers to kind of be dumb, but he is in fact incredibly smart, incredibly articulate. He knows a lot, and he knows how to weave a conversation to his liking, and he kind of decides who lives and who dies whenever they meet a group of people or a person. Now, the second one is my personal favorite, the quiet one, or the Watcher. Now, what's interesting about the Watcher is that he's blind. And the Watcher, his thing is that he barely speaks at all, and instead he decides to sit back and watch. Now, you may be wondering, how does he do that? He's blind. I know, but that's how I don't know, he just adds this ominous, creepy presence to the room. And like he can see and he knows everything that's going on, and he just kind of peers into your soul with his white eyes. Or that's how I pictured him anyway. Now, the third one is the most horrific. He is probably the horror character in this story, and I call him the brutal one. Now, he is obviously the most physically violent of the three. He loves destruction and murder, and he's the most savage, remorseless character I think I've read of besides Judge Holden. And while all three strangers are violent, he's the most overtly sadistic. He's insane. And he doesn't really talk, he's just crazy. This is Editor Banjo here. I forgot to mention that the brutal one is also mute, which I thought was kind of cool. I just forgot to put that in there, so fun little fact for you. And he carries out all of the acts that the group does. Now, I think each of these characters kind of resembles something. So when it comes to the leader, he kind of represents an intellectualized evil that kind of justifies his cruelty with logic, which is terrifying. Kind of think Anton Chigurh. I know I'll cover a lot more well-known McCarthy books, but I really wanted to cover some lesser-known ones, the ones that aren't really talked about on YouTube. So whenever I talk about McCarthy books in the future, you're going to see a lot of, he kind of does similar ideas, but he executes them differently. The leader kind of reasons the same way Judge Holden does, and the quiet one kind of, or I guess the leader is kind of Anton Chigurh and Judge Holden in a way, but all three characters are incredibly different. But I'll save those characters for a different video. Now, the quiet one, he kind of represents an inevitability of fate. An observer who watches suffering and does nothing to stop it. He just lets it happen, as if it's always meant to happen. Now, the brutal one, he embodies this kind of raw, chaotic evil, the kind that kills for no reason. No sense of judgment, no remorse, just because he can. What happens with Kulla and these people? Well, this is by far the most horrific part of the story. This is what has been building up this entire time. And while the men are talking... Actually, I gotta go get the book, I gotta read. Now, I have in front of me the actual book, so once again, I'll just tell you, this scene is incredibly graphic, and what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and like dramatize the book a little bit, kind of like an audiobook, but I'm just going to read it to you, and this is what happens to Kulla. Holm, and by the way, they kind of just refer to him as Holm, even though his name is Kulla, since that's his last name, but I'll just keep reading. Holm came limping out of the woods and crossed a small field toward the light. Insects rising out of the dark and breaking on his face like rain and his fingers trailing in the tops of the wet sedge. He could hear no sound save a faint moaning like the wind, but there was no wind. When he entered the glade, he could see men seated about the fire, and he hobbled on, one hand raised into the firelight. When he saw what figures warmed there, he was already among them, and it was too late. There were 3 of them, and there was a child squatting in the dust, and beyond them the tinker's cart, with hung pans catching the light like baleful eyes of some outsized and mute and mindless jury assembled there hurriedly against his coming. "Howdy," said the bearded one. "I ain't seen you for a while." He looked at them. They wore the same clothes, sat in the same attitudes, endowed with a dream's redundancy. Like revenants that reoccur in lands laid waste with fever, spectral, palpable as stone. He looked at the child, It had a healed burn down one side of it, and the skin was papery and wrinkled like an old man's. It was naked and half coated with dust so that it seemed lightly furred, and when it turned to look up at him, he saw one eyeless red angry socket, like a stokehold to a brain in flames. He looked away. "Sit, and rest a spell," the man said. Holmes squatted, favoring his off leg. The child kept watching him. "Who's youngern?" he said. Harmon guffawed and slapped his thigh. "What happened to his eye?" Holmes said. "What eye?" "His eye," he gestured. "The one he ain't got. I reckon he must have lost it somewheres. He's still got one. He ought to have two. Maybe he ought to have more'n that. Some folks has two and can't see." Holmes didn't say anything. "I reckon the tinker might know what happened to it." "What tinker?" "That and—" They use some fun language in this book. "That and Yan Shree," said Harmon, pointing with the rifle. "Hush. Don't pay him no mind, mister. What did you do to your leg there?" "Nothing." The bearded one was tunneling gouts of mud from the welt of his boot with a stick. "Well, I see you didn't have no trouble finding us. I was hunting ye. You got here all right for somebody bound elsewhere." "I wasn't bound nowheres. I just seen the fire." "I like to keep a good fire. A man never knows what all might chance along, does he?" "No." "No! Anything's liable to wash up, from nowheres to no bound." "Where are you bound?" Holmes said. "I ain't," the man said. "By nothing." He looked up at Holmes. "We ain't hard to find, once you found us." Holmes looked away. His sweat-blistered forehead shone in the firelight. He looked toward the tinker's cart and he looked at the child. "Where's she at?" he said. "Who's that?" "My sister." "Ah," said the man. "The one run off with that tinker. Them's his traps yonder." The bearded one turned his head slightly and looked at her back. "Aye," he said. "That you used to trade with." "I never give him no chap," Holmes said. "I just told her that." "Maybe this'n's some other chap." "It ain't nothing to me." The bearded one raked a goblet of clay from his stick and cast it into the fire. "You know what I figure?" he said. "What?" "I figure you got this thing here in her belly your own self, and then laid it off on that tinker." "I never laid nothing off to no tinker." "I reckon you'd figured he'd keep him hid for you." "I never figured nothing. What did you have to give to him?" "I never give nobody nothing. I never had nothing." "Never figured nothing?" "Never had nothing. Never was nothing," the man said. He was looking at nothing at all. The mute one seemed to sleep, crouched to the man's right with his arms dangling between his knees like something waited to be wakened and fed. "What are you?" Holmes muttered. "What?" He said it again sullenly. The bearded one smiled. "Ah," he said. "Now, we've heard that before, ain't we? You ain't nothing to me." But the man did seem to hear. He nodded as if spoken by other voices. He didn't look at Holmes. "You never did say what you done with your sister?" "I never done nothing with her." "Where's she at?" "I don't know. She run off." "You done told that." "It ain't nothing to you." "I'll be the judge of that." Harmon turned his cheek against the upright rifle barrel. He smiled dreamily. "I reckon little sister's just a further out up the road." "Ain't she?" the man said. "I don't know. I ain't seen her." "No." "I allowed maybe you had," Holmes said. "You seem to know everybody's business. I guess it ain't nothing to me. Is that right?" Holmes didn't answer. The man wiped the stick and poked into the fire, stretched forth his boot. "Hand him here," he said. "What?" "Hand him here, young chap." Holmes didn't move. The child had not stopped watching him. "Unless you'd rather for Harmon to." He looked up at Harmon and then bent forward and picked up the child. He made no gesture at all. It dangled from his hands like a dressed rabbit, a gross eldritch doll with a rickety-sprung legs, and one eye opening and closing softly like a naked owl's. He rose with it and circled the fire and held it out toward the man. The man looked at it a moment and then took it, one hand by his upper arm, and placed it between his feet. "What do you want to do with him?" Holmes said. "Nothing. No more than you do." "He ain't nothing to me." "No?" "Where's that tinker at if he was raising him?" "He's all raised out. He can't raise no more." "You don't need him." Water in the summer and fire in the winter is all that I need. We ain't talking about what I need. He spat across the child's head into the fire, and a thin chain of sparks ascended in a gray-green smoke. That ain't what's concerned. No. You ain't no different from the rest. From any man born and raised to have his own and die. They ain't one man in 3 got even a black suit to die in. Holmes stood with his feet together, and his hands at his sides like one arranged. What's his name? The man said. I don't know. He ain't got an Aryan. No, I don't reckon I don't know. They say people in hell ain't got names, but they had to be called something to get sent there, didn't they? That tinker might have named him. It wasn't his to name. Besides, names die with namers. A dead man's dog ain't got a name. He reached and drew from his boot a slender knife. Holmes seemed to be speaking to something in the night, beyond them all. My sister would take him, he said. That chap. We could find her, and she'd take him. Yes, the man said. I've been hunting her. Harmon was watching the man. Even the mute one stirred. The man took hold of the child and lifted it up. It was watching the fire. Holmes saw the blade wink in the light, like a long cat's eye slant and malevolent, and a dark smile erupted on the child's throat, and went all broken down to the front of it. The child made no sound, and hung there, with its one eye gazing over like a wet stone at a black blood pumping down its naked belly. The mute one knelt forward. He was drooling and making little whimpering noises in his throat. He knelt with his hands outstretched and nostrils dimpled delicately. The man handed him the child, and he seized it up, looked once at Holmes with witless eyes, and buried his moaning face in its throat. Now, I know that was insanely brutal, and that was also a really long read, but essentially what happens is Kula comes across these men, and they talk with him. And actually, one of the men did have a name. It was Harmon. Harmon is the brutal one. He's the nut job, the one that's insane. And when he comes across these men and upon this brutal scene, Holmes sees the tinker's cart, and he knows that these 3 men have his son. And what they do is they talk to him for a moment, and you can reverse the video if you want to remember what they said, but essentially what it was, you don't care about this baby, not enough to even give him a name. All you cared about was yourself. You ran away, it's your fault. And so what they do is they take the baby, and they murder it, and they eat the baby. And I told you this was going to be an incredibly brutal thing to read, and it was horrible. But there is a lot in this book to learn. Now, I know there's darkness here. It's incredibly dark, it's incredibly sad, but the ending kind of explains a lot. So, I'll read the ending to you, if you don't mind. In later years, he used to meet a blind man. By the way, this is not the same blind man as the Watcher. This is a different blind man. Ragged and serene, who spoke him a good day out of his constant dark. He overtook him, tapping through the bright noon dust with his cane, his head erect in that air of wonder the blind wear. Holmes would go by, but now the blind man had stopped him with his greeting. "How you?" Holmes said. "Well as ever," said the blind man. "Have you a smoke?" "No, sir, I ain't." "Nary at all?" "I don't have the habit." "Aye," said the blind man. He unbuttoned the bib of his overalls and brought forth tobacco. "Well," he said, "it's good to see the sun again, ain't it?" Holmes looked at the cups of blue phlegm, which regarded him. "It is," he said. "Aye." After so long a time, he trickled tobacco into the slender trough of paper in his fingers, and put away the pouch. "It is right a pretty day," Holmes said. The blind man smiled. "I know ye," he said. "I spoke afore with ye." "You might have," Holmes said. "I don't remember." The blind man twisted up the ends of his cigarette and took it between his lips. "Yes," he said. I've passed you on these roads before. There's lots of people on the roads these days, Holmes said. Yes, the blind man said. I pass them every day. People going up and down in the world like dogs, as if they wasn't a home nowheres. But I knowed I'd seen you before. Holmes spat. I gotta get on, he said. Yes, the blind man said. Is there anything you need? Need? Anything you need. I don't need nothing. I always like to ask. What are you selling? I ain't selling nothing. I'm at the Lord's work. He don't need your money. It's good he don't need mine. I reckon you're some kind of preacher. No, no preacher. What is there to preach? It's all plain enough, word and flesh. I don't hold much with preaching. Holmes smiled. What have you got to give, old blind man, like you asking folks what they need? I don't know. Nobody never said. Well, how would you expect to get it? Just pray for it. You always get what you pray for? Yes, I reckon. I wouldn't pray for what wasn't needful. Would you? I ain't never prayed. Why don't you pray back for your eyes? I believe it'd be a sin. Them old eyes can only show you what's done there anyways. If a blind man needed his eyes, he'd have eyes. Still, I believe you'd like to see your way. What needs a man to see his way when he's sent there anyhow? I gotta get on, Holmes said. The blind man leaned one hand on the cane where he had rested it against his leg. He sucked on the cigarette, and 2 jets of blue smoke slid from his thin nostrils and faded in the air. I heard a preacher in town one time, he said. A healing preacher. Wanted to cure everybody, and they took me there. There was a bunch of people there, all crippled folks and one old man. They did claim, throwed down his crutches, and they told it he could make blind see. And there was a feller leapt up and hollered out that nobody knowed what was wrong with. And they said it caused that preacher to go away. But they's darksome ways afoot in this world. And it may be he weren't no true preacher. I gotta get on, Holmes said. I always did want to find that feller, the blind man said, and tell him. If somebody don't tell him, he'll never will have no rest. I'll see you, Holmes said. Aye, the blind man said. It might be we'll meet again sometime. Holmes raised a hand in a inane farewell, and set off down the road again. The blind man's cane softly tapping faded behind him. He went on, soundless with his naked feet, shambling, grace-loring, down out of the peaceful mazy fields. His toed tracks soft from the dust among the cratered shapes of horse and mule hooves, and before him under the high afternoon sun his shadow wandered in a dark parody of his progress. The road went on through a shadeless burn, and for miles there were only charred shapes of trees in a dead land where nothing moved save windy rifts of ash that rose dolorous and died again down the blackened corridors. Late in the day he rode into a swamp, and that was all. Before him stretched a spectral of waste, out which he reared only the naked trees and attitudes of agony, and dimly hominoid figures in a landscape of the damned. A faintly smoking garden of the dead that tended away to the earth's curve. He tried his foot in the mire before him, and it rose in a vulvate welt claggy and sucking. He stepped back. A stale wind blew from this desolation, and the marsh reeds and black ferns among which he stood clashed softly like things chained. He wondered why a road should come to such a place. Going back the way by which he came, he met again the blind man, tapping through the dusk. He waited very still by the side of the road, but the blind man passing turned his head and smiled upon him with his blind smile. Holmes watched him out of sight. He wondered where the blind man was going, and did he know how the road ended? Someone should tell a blind man before setting him out that way. That ending quote. I'll read it again. Someone should tell a blind man before setting him out that way. Now, this book is, like I said, insanely dark. There's a lot of things that I don't think you'd find in your average book, but that ending quote really stuck with me. Someone should tell a blind man where he's going before they set him off that way. And it made me think, the blind man is the content one. He is the smart one. He said he doesn't need his eyes. If he did need them, he would have them. And that makes me think about Kola. he was referring to Kola. Kola is the true blind man of this story. He is not blind to his sin, but he is blind to the thing he should do. No, he knows he should go back. He should take care of the child, even though it was his fault. He should not have indulged in the temptation. But the temptation got the best of him, and that set off the course of the rest of this story. And you can really learn a lot from Kola here. Can you run away from your sin? Was the question I put on the thumbnail of this video. And the answer is no. Your sin will forever follow you unless you choose to repent from it, unless you choose to deal with it. There is no way out unless you can acknowledge what you've done wrong. That's the message that we've learned today. So, thank you a lot. Thank you for watching this video. I beg you, read Outer Dark if you have time. And remember, I'll read it for you again. Someone should tell a blind man before setting him out that way. You need to learn your own course. You need to acknowledge what you've done. You can't walk the rest of your life without knowing the sins you've made. I know that too. As a, I want to put that out there. As a Christian man reading these stories, I learn a lot. And that really stuck with me. There is no possible way to escape unless you face it. So, thank you for watching today's video. I don't care if you like or subscribe, I'm just here to make these videos for fun. So, I thank you so much for watching. Keep reading, keep learning, keep growing, and I'll see you in the next video. Banjo out.